So here we are again. It doesn't seem like 3 months have gone past since our last little chat about the state of the nation and things. I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend John Corrie today. What's changed in Q1 of 2021 from your perspective, John?
Well, technically, we did this just before Christmas, if I remember right, and I'm not sure anyone was getting vaccinations at that point. So the world has now discovered vaccinations, plus or minus some questions about whatever, but lots of people are being vaccinated. It's starting to roll out. Maybe we're starting to see some transitions in the data. It's maybe too early, but what that is given is everybody's a bit more optimistic about, we have a glide path, we have a, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It might be quite some distance, but it'll probably be the end of the tunnel will be in 2021. The UK, the US, Europe, whatever, Israel in particular maybe is leading the way when it comes to vaccinations. So we are starting to think about, as a collective group, when I say we, how things will transform, how they'll switch. I'm not going to say switch back in any strong sense, because I don't see us switching back. I see people engaging and being more social, more public, but I also have realized, and many others have too, that we can be highly effective with this online channel. And maybe you don't need to fly as much, maybe business meetings and being in the office 5 days is not necessary to prove that you're working. So I would think that we're going to see disruption in the office market for some time. The retail sector is still going to be hammered because a lot of people have realized that they now could do retail shopping for therapy and for engagement, but for a lot of staples, there's no need to go out. I'll get a haircut by the next time we do this. So there'll be dislocations. Now, from a housing point of view, which is mostly what we care about, there's been almost no impact in the sense that very few people have actually died. So very few people have, housing units have become available. People, though, have learned to think of their housing very differently. They need more common space. They need more room for the children to play or the person to work from a home office. Maybe two people plus 4 students all working from the house. The thickness of the pipe, the quality of the pipe when it comes to the broadband matters a lot. Outdoor space matters. I know a number of people, some personally and some more anecdotally, who have moved out of a big city into a more rural area. Technically, I've done that by switching to the other house, but in my case, it was just switching 2 houses. But a lot of people now are saying, they're enjoying the space. They would like to maybe go back to the big city, but they don't need to for the same business reasons. So we'll see quite a 2021 dislocation, but in a different way.
Yes, I mean, I myself are one of the people who've made what is a temporary exodus from city centre to outskirts, and it works for me. And as you say, we're now in a connected world where it doesn't really matter where you are. You can get on with things, and without distance being the issue that it once was. So people talk about the new normal, don't they? And
Yes.
Looking back to previous big episodes in life, whether it was the Spanish flu or for example, the Second World War, or many of these sort of pivotal moments which have changed things. Like, for example, the Second World War gave us penicillin, for example. Do you think that this past 12 months has been as important, not just for the property sector, but for our whole economy as a whole? Do you think it's been that much of a big deal?
So I do, and it's in very particular ways. So I was listening to someone who's in the HR function at a large corporate, and they said they've been able to accelerate 10 years worth of sort of corporate change and how they would function in the period of a year. The management and the employees have a new perspective on working. Now, here's what's quite funny. I was sitting at dinner the other night with someone, and if you think about when you went to university, for those who went to university, the professor assigns work. You have a certain set of tests coming up. More or less broad arc of the work. But there's no like, you must be here in these hours, you must sit in your chair and do your work. There's no sort of measuring how warm the seat is. And then we leave university and we go into a work environment, which is about warming the chair. So I think for those of us that are used to universities, we're going back to what we used to do. And it worked there. So white collar work is transition. Now, if you work with your hands, particularly if you work with your hands at a building site or a factory or something, physical presence is still required. You know, the picking parts, warehouse, the assembly plant, those businesses have had to adapt, but to stay open, they've also had to, in a sense, work through this, almost this whole period. So the new normal will affect different sectors differently and different people differently.
And yet, because we live in a connected economy, there are going to be sort of crossover effects between different sectors because of people's behavioural changes, many of which have been enforced on us out of necessity. So we will see a lot of real estate when we become available in city centres, whether it's from hotels that are no longer trading, whether it's from retail units which have now we've got into these habits now of just, even I've got into this habit, I'm something of a Luddite, of going online and ordering something and there it is next day. Those habits are not only hard to break, but I'm not sure that we would want to. We like the coffee shops. We like going off and having our hair done and this sort of thing. But do we really like queuing up in a shop to buy something which can just arrive at the front door?
Yeah, well, and you wouldn't have to carry it home and all the rest of that. And the return process works really well. And the price point and the shopping and the competitiveness. And we like to go to the coffee shops for almost the entertainment or the stimulation or it's not, we don't go to the coffee shops classically for work. We might go to a group session. I come out of Silicon Valley originally, and a lot of creative work does happen really well around a table, whiteboards or flip charts. And so you have group memory, people are drawing and moving things around and post-it notes on the wall. That bubble works extremely well. Most of the workday, though, doesn't involve that type of work. So you could easily do, quote, an offsite, which is really on-site in the office. And the offsite is no longer the offsite. Everybody's working from home. So you go to the office for the offsite, where you team building in the office instead of trying to go to a hotel somewhere.
Remarkable, actually, how quickly the planet has come together to connect, because was it, about 25 years ago that a coffee pot here in Cambridge, you must remember, that became the first thing to be streamed. And that, I think, later was sold for a charity for £60,000 or something. And nowadays, what we're doing now is very commonplace. And when I was a kid, I remember a television show called One World, where the Beatles played All You Need Is Love, and every little country around the globe chipped in with a little sort of 3-minute clip or whatever to demonstrate the miracle of satellite technology. Well, very soon we progressed to news reports coming from Washington, D.C. or whatever, and that became the norm. But now conversations such as we're having between ordinary folk have become the norm.
Yes, in fact, my experience growing up, I was in the US. I somehow associate the satellite stuff with not only the news, but particularly with the Olympics, that they were generally in some other time zone and they would have these satellite links and they would do a live interview, and then, oh, looks like satellite time was up, and that was the end of the interview. And it was neat and novel. I remember, because I am a certain age, going to my grandmother's to see the color TV, because we didn't have color at the house when I was growing up, and that came a little later. So these days, when you want to set up a Zoom meeting, do you have a computer? Yes. Do you have a smartphone? Yes. Which one would you like to do the Zoom meeting on? You don't need a lot of other stuff. You don't even need to plug stuff in. There's this thing called 5G or 4G, and you can do it over that. It's like, whoa, so you can be anywhere you want.
And everything has come together. I mean, I suppose the ingredients were already there at the turn of the millennium, because something that I thought for the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century was that what we needed was a technology convergence, and the sort of things that we do in our phone. And we needed a camera, we needed a hi-fi, a television, and all manner of gadgets, a compass or whatever it is. Exactly so. And the one little thing which can fit in your pocket, and that's something I didn't anticipate. I thought it would be a big box in the corner of the room. That this has now become a reality, largely thanks to what Silicon Valley achieved.
It's the miniaturization of electronics and this constant sort of shrinking of the chip size, increasing the performance, dropping the price point, and you get these neat and novel applications because it's like throwaway. This has more memory in it, like way more than the computers I used to share with other people when I was starting in my career, and the space, Apollo, or the whatever it was called, the thing that would reland. So the computers on those, my watch has more compute power than the Apollo missions. So this is that sort of S-curve long tail that we somewhat understood, but we didn't really understand the impact of, like, what if everybody has a supercomputer and every year or every 2 years they can upgrade it to the better version, and it has HD TV or better, and it has more memory than most people could afford. So there was a time in computing, probably right around when I started my career, that no one in the world could afford to buy a gigabyte of memory. Well, now a gigabyte is what you throw away and you watch.
It's the whole thing is quite extraordinary. I don't think, I mean, back when I was born, wasn't it IBM who predicted that the world would need 6 computers, I think, to do everything that we needed, and here we are, everybody's got more than that at home, and we don't necessarily call them computers, and that's a good bit of marketing. We call it my phone, but when actually what it is, as you say, it's a supercomputer. But people, that might have scared people, and they're all connected.
That's an interesting point. The embedded computers, like the sort of deluxe camera on top of my monitor that has a camera on top of my computer that has a camera, and the camera here, and the iPad that here. It's like, I don't know how many computers I have sitting here, and we're just talking.
And there wasn't there, tremendous technical innovation to bring us to where we are today. Because it's quite fun to talk about tech, so I hope you don't mind. And this phone, in a sense, is the pinnacle of it all at the moment. But where can it go from here? Because again, this will affect our lives, it will affect our economies, and it will affect what we do as property and other investors as well. Is there a next step, do you think?
Well, let me shrink it into property. So one of the things I dislike are spreadsheets. Way back when, there was a company called Lotus, which used to be Lotus One. They had a product 123, and it had the biggest share of the market. And they figured out that 70% of all the spreadsheets had errors in the formulas. And the problem was most people didn't know which ones had the errors, as in which cells. And it's just this habit of trashing it. So I dislike the idea that we hand out the spreadsheet, and then when it gets broken, or when we realize we have new functionality, we don't know who to send it to because we don't know where it went. So the more we put things into the cloud, the more we put things into apps, I can update the app on everybody's device without having to know where they are. And as long as they collaborate and say yes, then if I have to put out a fix, it's done. There's a lot of things like that where we can buy £100 worth of real estate deal through crowdfunding legally. We can maybe run an app to compute the numbers. We can watch the recording of the build, the time lapse even. So it becomes more immersive, and it becomes easier for people to collaborate at distance and collaborate pots of money into deals, and you following the regulatory framework, quote, the sky's the limit.
And other ways in which technology has progressed. I mean, I went yesterday to see my first eco build being done, and this stuff, a piece of ground with okay footings in there, and over the course of 6 or 7 hours, a house suddenly appeared from nowhere, all watertight, with all the cable connections and everything, all ready for the first fix. And an architect with a spirit level was just going around checking, a bit like, I don't know if you ever had the child's toy Lego. Well, it was a bit like that, but it was all kind of zero carbon when it's finished, and all watertight by 4 p.m. So again, we're seeing a revolution in construction techniques as well, which is going to absolutely revolutionize the way we do things. Because if we can put up one house a day, then that sort of shortage of housing is going to shrink, even in a country that's very regulation heavy like the UK.
So if you can put up a house in a day, you have less water damage and other weather issues. You have less pilferage from the site of materials or tools. You end up with less finance costs because you shrink the window. You probably have been doing some of the construction in a more controlled environment. So you have less sort of, you can't pour concrete when it's below freezing. Well, if we don't have to pour, great. You know, and we're gonna make this waterproof in the factory before we put it on site, things like that. So you start taking a lot of the risks out and you start taking a lot of the costs out. And yes, you dislocate a lot of the labor and then it needs to sort of move around. But some of the labor says, I'll happily do the electrical work in the factory and stay dry and warm every day, rather than being on a freezing build site every day and having to figure out where to drive to all the time. So you suddenly get to reinvent that process. Well, that's what COVID has done for a lot of businesses. It's forced them to reinvent, like, what does it mean to get stuff done? What does it mean to deliver whatever we do for our customers? And what does it mean to, like, we need space, or do we, to do this? Now, there's a satisfaction metric that someone measured, maybe false positive, false negative, but it shows that people seem to be more satisfied working from home, even if they're working more hours, partially because they don't feel the overhead of the travel, and they can better take advantage of, maybe put a load of laundry on, maybe take a break to do an exercise routine, maybe not have to waste time and money getting all jazzed up with their clothing, taking advantage of some time with the child, or maybe hitting some golf balls in the back garden with a relative, and then working a little later in the evening. So you're more in control, but yet you're still able to produce whatever it is you're supposed to produce, if again, it's a white collar type work. So even the factory though, if you can consolidate, like we talked about, and build in the factory and assemble on site, that actually might have higher job satisfaction. And they can end up having better tools. They can have pneumatic tools, they can have electrical tools, that they're not always scurrying around, loading it in a van, taking it out of a van, driving around the van, getting it stolen overnight from the van.
So we may see whole cities built in this way. And I don't know if you've seen, as of this week, a new video came out with kind of CGI interpretations of what the first colonies on Mars might look like, the first cities there. That's all been envisaged as well. But somewhat closer to home, I think supply chains have been tested to the limit as well during the COVID thing. Yeah. And so perhaps a one-stop shop, so local communities which make everything they need through 3D printing or whatever, may also come to fruition. They may 3D print their houses. They may not even have to come from a factory.
Correct.
We may got robots to do that.
Exactly.
So the whole landscape's going to change, isn't it?
We've had Brexit in the same period. So we've had the overlay of Brexit and COVID when it comes to supply chain. So we've had trouble at some of the ports because people they're ill or not able to work. So then the containers are backed up. I just talked to a client earlier. He had shipped some stuff from India. It got all the way to the UK, and then it went sent all the way back because they didn't have room to take the container off.
Oh my! And then it ended up stuck in the Suez Canal, no doubt, in a traffic jam.
No. This was before that happened.
No,
but
I understand.
There's all these repercussions and all these sort of follow-on activities, and some of them will sort themselves out fairly quickly. The whole Northern Ireland scenario with where's the border with the UK, and some merchants are saying, look, the volume is too small for me to try to figure this out, so I'm just going to get out of that part of the market. And there's dislocations everywhere.
Borders will become, I think, less significant in future. For example, now with outsourcing work, it will become more the norm for people not to go into corporate HQ every day. And on that basis, do they really have to live within the borders? I mean, we've had sort of outsourced call centers and this kind of thing, but I think that's going to expand dramatically.
Well, I'm 5 time zones away from you right now. And I'm not sure anyone watching has to be in the UK. So the topic and the content can be highly relevant, even if the individuals aren't co-located. Again, it favors white collar stuff, but it also favors businesses that are flexible, where they may build whatever they build in a factory or however they do that. Maybe it's robots, maybe it's staff, doesn't matter. But then the user experience, the premium value could be on something else. I order things from Amazon, not because of where the factory is. I order things from Amazon because of the service delivery, the return policy, things like that. And the fact that it's relatively sharp pricing when it comes to, I don't feel like I'm probably getting ripped off, so I don't even have to put time into looking around. It's like, look, if I could beat this price, I don't care. This will get delivered. My wife ordered some the other day, 2 hours later. Okay. So they're sort of staging. There's the big warehouse, then there's the smaller warehouses, so they can deliver the stuff that's commonly ordered quicker. Well, ordering it and having it 2 hours later and not having to go out, you might be busy with meetings and boom, it's there, instead of running to the store and doing whatever else you have to do.
Yes, and I think it goes way beyond white collar as well. I mean, we saw it, didn't we? The American military, who have pilots flying drones on the other side of the world, but it's going to go beyond that. With the rollout of 5G, the latency issues in the network are going to all intents and purposes, dissolve. So you could have one guy managing 5 or 6 refuse collection trucks and dealing with any issues that popped up, and they're sort of going around from door to door. There was a case, I believe that was in Japan, where there was a restaurant where all the waiters were automatons, and they found people, didn't they, with physical impairments to work them, to move these automatons around the place. So other kinds of really imaginative ways of working that we couldn't possibly have envisaged even a decade or two ago, I think are also going to become more and more part of the workplace.
There's a sort of a learning model which is about feedback loops, and that you learn from doing things and then you improve, and you want an essentially short and inexpensive feedback loops. And there's a lot of change that has happened, and this goes back to the HR comment, that we couldn't imagine it, but because COVID then forced it, we were able to test things. We found out what works, we found out what didn't work, we adapted. And because everybody was open to being flexible, given the situation, and we see this throughout history, that whether it's a war or something, that certain things changed because, well, we needed to, and this is what we came up with. And after the event was over, we realized it worked pretty well, so we stuck with it.
Indeed. Now, in a UK specific context, bring it close to home and to the property market, traditionally, we've had to live, I don't know, in the city of London. Traditionally, we've needed things like HS2 to allow us to get there faster and so forth. But if we've got total, I mean, and at the moment, okay, there is a fashion. I mean, I had a city centre property that I wished to sell last year, which absolutely stuck, not a single offer. So obviously, being a property kind of guy, I put it back into the rental arena and carried on with it. And that's what happens. But in Spanish flu, thinking back 100 or so years, there was a sort of 2 or 3 period thereafter, sort of buffer zone, where people weren't too comfortable about going out again. They didn't have a vaccine. They didn't have the kind of certainty that we're going to have. But people might develop habits of going, I like to look out of my window and look over rolling hills or look over the sea or that kind of thing. So there's no necessity that specifically, I think people of a certain age won't need to go back into the cities. Maybe for young people, this idea of mingling and the nightlife and the social aspect of it might be a kind of draw. But I don't think for the rest of us, it'll be, if I want to spend a night out in London, I'll just go on the train and come back.
Yeah, well, maybe. A couple things. First of all, we should touch on the whole Grenfell cladding topic, because Q1, that's been a big event, even though the trigger was many years earlier, but it's suddenly come home to a lot of people. Second is this idea of going forward, progressive, innovative companies, particularly ones that are struggling to hire and they don't have the money to compete on price, might offer different work environments. And say there are some investment firms that said, we're never going to require you to come back to the office. So will they be able to cherry pick better staff? And those that are sort of stuck in the mud, you must be in the office, will end up with staff to not only enjoy that, but staff who couldn't work in the better places. So you see a ratcheting.
So a bit of a polarization, yeah.
Yes. Now, I like taking the train from London to Scotland on the overnight sleeper, and you get to leave quite late, as I think of it. You know, it's close to midnight. You could show up a little early and get set up in your bed if you want, or you could just show up right at the last minute. And then you wake up the next morning, 7 a.m. in Edinburgh or Glasgow. And with the newer version, there's even showers if that's important. That saves you a bunch of time. And do I really care which bed I'm in? Sort of not. And I sleep reasonably well. It's not exactly the same as sleeping in a bed that's stationary because it's moving, but it seems like a big time savings. So think of a few years going forward. We have autonomous cars and they look like rolling beds. And you get in London at whatever time you want, and you show up in Scotland the next morning, or whatever number of hours, or down in Devon or way out in the far reaches. That if we have autonomous cars, why can't I be sleeping the whole 8 hours? So I can commute to places, do something, and commute back. Or I could be in this autonomous car where it's my office. So it's a desk in a wrapper that autonomously gets me somewhere. And I've rented it for the day, I've rented it for the trip, I've rented it for the week. But I don't need to have my own car, so I don't need a driveway, I don't need a parking space. I can get the bed when I need one. I can get the pickup truck or heavy loader or whatever when I need one. I can even possibly just load stuff in and say, now go, and someone will unload you at the other end. Well, that then competes with the idea of HS2 or something. You don't have to like build this massive infrastructure thing to then run the trains up and down. It's like, no, we have the roads already, and we'll just get rid of the drivers.
I mean, there have been these compressed air tubes, haven't there, that move you at extraordinary speed. So that's possibly another possibility. But
that's if you do it fast. Yeah.
Yes. Now that is fast, but as far as cars are concerned, you and I will probably not own our own car in 10 years' time, and there'll be an app, a sort of advanced version of Uber or something, where you dial up this thing and this robotic thing arrives, takes you to where you want to go, and goes off to get somebody else. And that's much more efficient as well. It's a much more efficient use of the resource, because then that resource is constantly deployed, and you don't have the overhead of ownership.
Just like cloud computing, I don't need big servers for my business. I rent what I need when I need it. It's in the cloud, and that's shared with a bunch of other people. Now, just as a little data point, so I got rid of the 2 cars a little over a year ago, 1 in each country. So those have been sold off. So I have been carless for a year.
Which is extraordinary. And yeah, coming back to then computing, since you touched on the cloud, we've gone from a situation of back when I started in computing, of kind of dumb terminals with something quite powerful at the other end, via things very powerful on our desktops, and back to the sort of terminal model as well, with something
exactly.
which is, so it's amazing how that's come full circle, except that now the thing on the other end is probably embedded inside a mountain in some kind of earthquake-proof structure with infinitely better backup and support than an individual company could have had in the past.
Yes, except it's 20 different mountains in 20 different locations.
Indeed so. Indeed so. To wrap this today, then, John, I mean, we've looked sort of far ahead into the future, but sort of bringing it back into sort of Q2 of 2021, as we start to emerge from our cocoons, I guess on both sides of the big pond. How is that going to impact, do you think, the property markets in this second part of the year?
So UK is seeing 2 phenomena that I think are noteworthy. One is the whole cladding issue has caused a tremendous dislocation in anyone that has a unit in a building that's above 18 meters. There was some defective standards, never mind probably inappropriate equipment installed. And therefore there's a real constipation in the flats or that end of the market, and that's 10% or more of the UK housing market is basically on paper worthless because you can't actually buy it or sell it. So what's it worth? In the US and also in the UK, we've seen a shift from city centers. There have been some destination spots, whether it's the Cotswolds in the UK or in the US, Reno, Nevada area, Lake Tahoe, that have seen spikes and some massive increases in house prices in the places that everybody says, one day I'd like to move to. Well, one day happened. And in some of the higher priced areas, maybe London, maybe New York, maybe San Francisco or something else, you're seeing softness in the market because when you move a lot of people out at the same time, that perturbs prices. I think you'll see people wanting to be back in the cities, the older, the younger. There are people who like theater or whatever. Some of these things are very experiential, but whether you live there all the time, whether you come in, like you said, train, automated car, whatever. So on a housing level, I think people are gonna like, I need a little bit more space. In my personal situation, I've had a tenant move out, they had finished and they were moving on, but this other tenant moved in because they were moving from one building to the one that I had a unit in because they wanted more space because they're both working from home. And now space was something they really saw the value of. So we're seeing some reshuffling of the deck. We're seeing relocation in the areas, and we're seeing spikes in the US in particular in some places and a little bit in the UK. House prices in some areas or flats, houses, apartments are really on the up. And then in other areas, they're a little bit weak. And then that unique problem in the UK right now with the whole building standards.
Well, John, thank you ever so much for that very comprehensive update on well, Q2 and beyond. And we look forward to seeing you in 3 months' time for the next session.
Should be interesting then.
Thank you.
Speak again, everybody.